again to the Eisenhower Presidential Library Museum and Boyhood Home for our panel on life on the home front. I'm Tim Reeves, the Deputy Director. Before I get started with our remarks, this panel will go till about 2 p.m. and then we'll have time for some questions and answers with our home front panel. Then we'll take a 10 or 15 minute break and then we'll proceed with our life on the battlefield with our veterans. So that's all coming up this afternoon. Well, in his book, The Second World War, the late distinguished military historian John Keegan writes, "The Second World War is the largest single event in human history, fought across 6 of the world's 7 continents and all its oceans. It killed 50 million human beings, left hundreds of millions of others wounded in mind and body, and materially devastated much of the heartland of civilization." Well, this largest single event in human history, of course, affected life here in Abilene, as well as in communities around the world and where our panelists were during the war. And I'll begin our introductions with our Abilene resident, my immediate right, Marge Olson. And Marge spent the war, part of the war in Texas and Oklahoma, as she followed her husband from post to post, and including time in a defense plant in Amarillo, Texas, that I know we'll talk about. Next on our panel, Doris Snyder. Spent part of the war in Akron, Ohio. Not exactly Navy Rosie the Riveter, but similar type war work. Doris is also the mother of our museum curator, William Snyder. And we've made this panel into a real family affair, as you'll see in a moment. Skipping down to the end of the table, because this is the way I arranged my remarks, Bob Reeves spent the war as a boy in western Oklahoma. He went on to Oklahoma A&M, now of course Oklahoma State University, where he studied journalism. Bob, while he was there, met Priscilla, and they married in 1955. The blessed event, also known as my birth, occurred 4 years later. Where were you on that day? What were you doing? What was your reaction to the news? What was the first noticeable change in your life?
I was working at Firestone Tire and Rubber Company in Akron, Ohio on that day. And that day changed my life a lot because my husband enlisted in the Marine Corps that very day. He felt that it was the thing to do, even without asking me. But I guess it was the right thing for him to do because he didn't, no disrespect to Eisenhower, he didn't want to be in the Army. So he thought he could get what he wanted if he enlisted ahead of time. He enlisted in the Marine Corps, and believe it or not, he enlisted in Cleveland, Ohio, and they never even let him return home. They sent him directly to San Diego that very minute. And he didn't even have a toothbrush. He didn't get to say goodbye to his parents or nothing, or to me. Of course, we weren't married at the time. We were engaged, yes. But that's what happened to me on Pearl Day. I was working at Firestone. I wasn't exactly Rosie the Riveter. I was a Firestone in order to accommodate us. They built Quonset huts right on the factory ground. So I wasn't in the main plant. I was down in this Quonset hut. And in the bottom of the Quonset hut, they were building wings, just wings, for the Curtiss planes in the war. And I was working up on the second floor. No air conditioning. Believe me, it was warm. But we knew we had a job to do, so we did it. A man was sent down from New York to train me to operate this huge, it was like a typewriter keyboard. It was about 4 feet long. And believe it or not, it paid the bills and ordered the materials that we needed to build the wings, all on this machine. It made the checks and it kept the accounts right on this machine. I guess it was the nearest thing we had to a computer back in those days. And that was my Pearl Harbor in a nutshell, I guess.
Thank you. Marge, how about you? If we can move the microphone.
Yeah.
was a new bride. I had been married 3 months, and we were living right here in Abilene, supposed to be happily ever after. And on that day, I remember the radio was on, and I remember definitely hearing President Roosevelt tell us about Pearl Harbor, and I knew then it was going to change my life. Actually, within just a few short months, my husband did leave for the service, and I became not only war bride, but eventually I did become Rosie the Riveter for a short time in Amarillo, Texas. But it definitely changed our lives.
Mr. and Mrs. Reeves, your experience was a little different as dependent children at the time that the war broke out. What are your memories of December 7th and of your parents' reactions?
Well, for me, it probably took away, since my birthday was the next day, my 6th birthday, I probably didn't appreciate all of that attention to the Pearl Harbor. But it impacted us because I had 3 older brothers. So it was something that we were my family was very aware of the significance. It's a big deal.
I was playing in a flower bed in the front yard, digging, and Mother came out and told me that the Japanese had attacked, and it sort of registered as a big thing, but it got even bigger because Dad was preparing a Christmas lighting decoration for our house, and he at that moment altered it to become a V for victory, and he asked me whether the Morse code signal for V was 3 dots and a dash or 3 dashes and a dot, and I told him correctly that it was 3 dots and a dash. We won second prize in the city, which was $10, so I began as a war profiteer.
Well, your 3 dots and a dash reminds me of something really interesting that I didn't learn until recently, that I was tossing here, that most of you probably knew, that during the war, the BBC used the opening refrain of Beethoven's Fifth, which is da 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 da. And so they're subversively using the German composer to signify victory in Europe. Well, something that did really change, between 1940 and 1945, women in the workforce increased by more than 50%. In fact, nearly half of all American women took on some sort of job during World War II. And of course, it wasn't just defense work. Women moved into all types of new fields because of a male labor shortage. An Amarillo newspaper story was amazed that women were now driving taxis, checking and stocking groceries, selling men's clothes, operating or working as soda jerks, even managing department stores, and fixing flat tires. So it really was a revolution in the type of work that women did. Marge, we'll start back with you if you want to tell us a little bit more perhaps about some of the war work that you did in Amarillo where this article was written.
Well, that's where I became Rosie the Riveter. It was the first place we moved after basic training in Wichita Falls. And the first thing I had to do was, of course, get a job. I worked in a warehouse for a short time and learned that they were hiring war brides, especially wanted war brides, because they figured they'd be better workers for the defense plant there in Amarillo, Texas. Something that I never dreamed I'd ever do, and I cannot believe I did it, but I climbed an 8-foot ladder with a blowtorch in one hand and a roll of solder in the other hand, and welded a group of small pipes together to make one large pipe for helium. And that was just part of my experiences. I had other experiences there, but that was the one thing that shocks me today to think I did.
I know you followed Mr. Olson around during the war. Were some of those other jobs that you took on, not even defense work, but just some of the jobs, maybe jobs that men would have had during peacetime?
Well, in Amarillo, the first job I had in Amarillo, it was in a warehouse, and I had to push almost like a grocery cart around and fill orders. And you had to learn in a short time where everything was on shelves. It was so many miscellaneous things, and I had to devise some way of knowing where I was in all the hallways. And so I did that. Then in Oklahoma City, I don't know necessarily that men were doing it, but I did learn to do a teleprinter and worked for Western Union, running several branch offices throughout the city. The special one that comes to mind that might have been a little bit on the dangerous side was I worked at the stockyards, and I had to take the commuter train to the stockyards and check in before and after at the main office. Handled quite a bit of money. And here I was, 21, 22, getting on that commuter about 5 o'clock in the evening with my bag of money, a lot of money, riding the commuter train into the main office. Never dreamed it could have been dangerous. I'm not sure it was somewhat dangerous back there, but I sure wouldn't try it now.
Well, Doris, you told us a little bit about some of your work with that interesting early computer. What other jobs did you have?
That was about it.
That was enough.
Until my husband, or my fiance came back.
Yes.
So then we were stationed in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, because he got to come home early from South Pacific because he had been in 2 of the worst battles. He had been at Guadalcanal and Tarawa, and they were the first to employ into the water, into the land. So they needed R&R.
Absolutely. Well, Bob and Chrissy, your parents' experience would have been different since both fathers were not of military age. But how did the war change their work, and did your mothers take on work during the war that they would not have otherwise?
No, because I had 2 younger sisters. So she was a stay-at-home mom, but my dad was a builder. And because, well, we had moved from West Virginia when I was little to Florida, to Orlando, and that was before there was any speaking mice or princesses. There was nothing there but cornrows and sand. And my dad built a house for us there. And because he enjoyed building the house, so that later became his lifetime work, my dad, so when we moved to Ohio. So we had some experiences in Florida, and from there we moved to Texas. And Dad decided, because he had heard there was so much work in Ohio, because we had 4 rubber plants there at the time. Akron was known as the rubber capital of the world at that time, because we had Goodyear, Goodrich, General, and Firestone rubber plants there. And there was a lot of building there. He built up the whole city of Firestone Park. He built all the homes there, and it became his life work, and we did right well. We had 3 regular meals a day, although we'd been raised through the Depression, and I don't remember ever being hungry. Yes. And everybody was kind of in the same boat. So we didn't know we weren't privileged and had a lot of things. We thought we were so fortunate when we got an orange for Christmas. Not all this technology toys they have today. Yeah.
Well, Mr. and Mrs. Reeves, in terms of your homes in Oklahoma, your father's work, and perhaps the work your mother may have taken on during the war?
My dad worked for the electric company, and because of the war, they were very short-handed, which meant they worked a lot of extra hours, including no vacations for a long period. We also farmed. So in the time that he had not working for the electric company, we also worked at a farm. And in addition to that, a small Air Force base was built near our hometown, so he converted our double garage into an apartment that we rented to a pilot, which meant a great deal to me because I hung around him as much as I possibly could to soak up all the knowledge about flying P-40s and P-25s. So war was a real period of work, and then we also had a large garden, as almost everyone did. Mom spent a lot of time working on that. She did not work outside the home, but my brother and I managed to keep her fully occupied more than she wanted, I'm sure.
Well, and there were 5 of us, and I'm the baby, which I like to tell them all the time, of course. But my eldest brother did go into the service, and my sister's husband and my dad's brother, and Dad tried to, and they told him he was more valuable on the home front. He was also in the electric business. But we had the Victory Gardens. We collected scrap iron. I remember going without bubble gum, so that was a biggie when you're not very old. You have no bubble gum. But my mother worked fearlessly, and she was volunteer on many aspects of the home front, and she started a USO center in the little town where we lived. So about 3,000 population, and there was an army camp, 40 miles south of us in Texas. And so Mother decided the boys, the soldiers, mostly boys, were coming up on the train and looking for someplace when they had free time to get away from camp. And so she decided they'd have to have a good place. Can't just be bars, you know, and everything. So she talked to a lady who owned a lot of property and was a recluse in our little town, and she talked her into letting them use a building downtown. And she managed to talk, I guess, everybody into furnishing donuts and coffee and furniture and a piano and girls probably to help, and mothers and magazines and books and whatever it took to give the boys a place to go. And so that became my performance area because I got to play the piano, and I could play Home on the Range with 2 fingers. I knew that I must be glamorous and important. More effort.
Well, the Red Cross and USO that you bring up are kind of synonymous with the home front in World War II, as was rationing and war bond rallies, salvage drives, blood drives, civil defense drills, of course the Victory Gardens. What sort of memories do those activities raise, if any, of wartime shortages, as you said, with bubble gum, and children had trouble getting tires for their bicycles?
Well, one of my most frightening moments came as a result of that. When I was in the 4th grade, if we brought a pound of copper, brass, or bronze to school, we got a free movie ticket, and the movie involved a mummy that rose out of the swamp at midnight and would drag his foot on his way to consume his victims. And I walked home in the fog. Pursued by that stupid mummy every inch of the way.
That's going to be hard to top. Well, let's talk about another key day. We're here to commemorate D-Day, the 70th anniversary of D-Day. What are our D-Day memories? How did you hear the news? Where were you? What was your reaction to the news of the successful invasion? Was it one of hope? Was that sort of the light at the end of the tunnel after all these years? Anything come to mind?
Of course, I was working at Firestone on that day, and we had all heard at Firestone that D-Day was happening, and all the churches were open. So what I planned to do on my way home from work, I stopped at the church, prayed for my husband.
Okay, I remember that I, at the time, had taken my baby daughter, and my husband was overseas, and I was living on the farm with his folks, and my sister lived in Centralia, about 25 miles away, and she had 3 children, and her husband I packed up my baby daughter with clothes and the playpen that was her bed. I drove to Centralia, picked up my sister, and we started out in the wee hours of the morning. We were going to go celebrate someplace. We thought it would be down in Chase County in Flint Hills. The first thing we had was a flat tire. And here we were, we had to unpack kids and everything, and it was still dark. And we happened to be near a small town. And so we went to the filling station, and behind the filling station was the house, and we knocked on the door and woke him up. And the man was so happy when we told him it was D-Day and told him about it, that he came out and took care of our tire. Otherwise, I don't know how long we'd have been stranded.
How about meanwhile in Oklahoma?
Well, it took a while for the word to get there. The key dates I really remember were Jimmy Doolittle's raid and the atomic bomb, and the day President Roosevelt died. I was 12 when he died, and he was the only president we had during my lifetime. So that was really one of the big moments of the war, and I can remember D-Day and being fascinated by it, but it wasn't one of those, do you remember what you were doing when kinds of days in my life.
And sort of the same for me, and the day that Roosevelt died was, I do remember April 12, 1945, because we also had a tornado that about took most of the little town that I lived in away. So that probably took a little more significant to us. And also I had, well, I don't think I would know it.
We'll talk later. Well, another question. Since you two were both still in school, in grade school, did the war, was there a daily effect of the war? Was it constantly on people's minds? I'm sure they had siblings and parents involved in the war. How big of a presence was the war in your daily life at school?
It was huge. The teachers always posted war happenings. We learned a lot of geography because of the war and learned about other countries. They sold stamps for buying victory bonds each Monday morning at school. You could buy one either for a dime or a quarter. We had scrap drives through the school. One of the popular pastimes was for kids to bring war trophies that their brothers or fathers had sent to them, German helmets, Japanese helmets, and thinking of today's life, rifles, pistols, and all kinds of weapons showed up on a regular basis in grade school. These were great moments, and we passed them around for show and tell.
Well, I had letters, of course. I wrote to the brother, and I wrote to, and they wrote to me, and still have some of those. So that was something that was very appreciated. And rereading them now, it just takes you back. I mean, you're just transported back when you read those letters, and they loved everything that we would send, and I must say we were good about it. Everybody wrote, and everybody was a part. You know, that war touched everybody. Everybody you knew.
We worked together for lunch before the panel today just to kind of get our thoughts together as best we could. And he shared one item I thought was really interesting, and it was from the organization of a Red Cross chapter in a very small town in Oklahoma, raising money for the war effort and collecting items to help the Allies. What really struck me is that it's dated March 1941. And so these small communities in southeastern Oklahoma were already involved on the side of the Allies to some extent, you know, well before Pearl Harbor, which really came as kind of a surprise to me. Well, in the time we have left, to kind of go full circle, we keep mentioning these key dates. There's Victory in Europe Day, if there's any memory associated with that, or more perhaps Victory over Japan Day, more meaningful depending upon which theater your family member was in. And many particular memories of those two key dates.
Well, both VE Day and VJ Day mounted impromptu parades down Main Street. Everybody who had a pickup or car was driving and honking. So it was a celebration clear in the middle of the country and obviously extremely well received.
Well, as the folk singer Woody Guthrie said, peace hit St. Louis a lot harder than the war ever did. Well, we have some time for questions and answers of our panelists, but also just for you to be able to share your memories of the war as well. And Linda here will pass the microphone, which we please wait till you get the microphones so that the cameras will be able to pick up the audio.
Being young and during that time, in my studies at school, when I was getting my PhD, we talked to a lot of wives who lost their husbands in the current wars. What did the home front, what did the men and women do when a friend of theirs or a neighbor got news that they had actually lost a husband?
Are you speaking to me?
Anybody on the panel?
I lost 3 friends in the war. One, his ship was bombed and split in half, and he was asleep on the bottom deck. And the other one, Jerry's plane was bombed. And of course, they were all killed in the plane. And then Ben worked at Firestone with me. And I always felt so bad that he enlisted, because he was all that his mother had. He had no reason to enlist. He wouldn't have had to, but he did anyway. And he was all she did. And he did. I guess I was one of the lucky ones. My fiance came home and we got to be married and had 3 children. There's that one.
Another question for the panel?
This question is for Mrs. Olson and Mrs. Snyder. I heard the toughest job in the Army is an Army wife. How do you feel about that?
It was what?
The toughest job in the Army is an Army wife. Do you feel that is true?
Or a Marine
Or a
one?
Marine wife?
Let's see, when he got home, we were married in 3 weeks after he got home. The war was still going on, but he got to come home because of what he had been through. So that's why we were sent to Camp Lejeune. We lived there on base for, let's see, almost 2 years, I think. We lived on base. And it was one of the most fun times of my life. I could walk down to the ocean. I could walk to the grocery store. Even though we lived in what today they call a little travel trailer. And that's what all the married Marines lived in. And I had to learn to cook on a little camp stove that I had to pump up a little tank on the front of it. And we had some wonderful times. I made a lot of Marine friends and families because the whole base was family, mostly. And we had some lifelong friends. So actually it was a nice experience. I enjoyed. Now today I think North Carolina is my favorite state.
My experience was not the worst time of all. That for years, after my husband died in 1989, I had a recurrent dream that I was walking down a country lane to a mailbox, and I would get there would be no letters. And this dream continued throughout the years until I would say maybe in the last 10 years. And actually, that's kind of what had happened. There were days, to me, the lifeline and was the communication. And communication meant our husbands were in the Army were by letter. And no telephones, no iPads, no cell phones, no pictures, nothing. And then these letters, at least coming from Okinawa, would come, maybe you would go down to the mailbox for 2 or 3 days in a row, or maybe 5 days. And there would be no letters. And then maybe the next day there would be one. And when he was sent overseas, he didn't know where he was headed. I didn't know where he was headed because they zigzagged across the Pacific because of the Japanese, the subs. And it took about 6 weeks. He left the first part of June and didn't get into Okinawa until about the last of July. And then it was another 6 weeks before I heard from him. So to me, communication was the hardest part, and those were long, long months. Of course, I had a baby girl and I was busy, but still, it was hard, very hard. And I know that's why I continue to have a dream that referred to that time in my life.
Were your letters all cut out? Mine were so censored, it was usually just Dear Doris and a salutation or so chopped up. And I can't understand why the censors had to be so rough. Because my husband wasn't crazy enough to tell where he was to the prisoners of the enemy. Why did they chop them all up like that? I think they enjoyed it.
No, in answer to your question, mine were cut up.
They weren't.
But my husband never wrote very much about what was going on, except the discomfort of the rain and the mud that he was living in on Okinawa. But after he was dead, probably about at least 10 years, I was going through his things, and the first part of the diary showed nothing, so I was ready to toss it. And flipping back through, I came to the middle of the diary. He had started it when he left, not in the front of the diary. And in this diary, I learned about the snipers, the booby trap that he barely escaped, the strafing of his tent, of his homesickness, of the 170-mile typhoon, and all those things that he didn't write because he didn't want me to be upset.
Mrs. Reeves, you mentioned that the war was something that everyone felt was involved in, and being a spouse from the war today, where it's 1 or 2% of the population that feels the cost of the last war, do you have any suggestions on how we can help civilians understand that there's still that cost?
Actually, I'm a group of ladies at our church who have this kind of thing, I think, keeps it foremost in your mind. We have made greeting cards to send to the military so that they would have cards to send home to people. And it is something that when you work on it and you talk about it, you become very aware that these things are still going on. There are lonely people out there, and it also encourages them beyond, I know, the email and all that stuff, but you know those letters that you have in your hand that I still have from my brothers in the 40s mean a lot. And I think generally, talking about it and encouraging that kind of involvement because it means a tremendous amount. And it was mentioned earlier, when you live in a little town, you do lose people that you know very well. And I think everybody kind of huddles together, you try to support each other, and you're aware of everything that's going on in the lives. So you have to put yourself there.
Another question?
I want to say that I was in the Army, and when it was mealtime, it was a big deal. I think that the email and all that stuff is detrimental to the military, because just think of all the times that you could write a letter and those soldiers would get that letter and be really thrilled. I think that there needs to be a campaign of writing letters instead of all these emails, because they can keep those letters instead of, they can't keep the emails, they're in space. Letters are tangible.
And reread them. That's the
And
wonderful
years
part.
and years from now, those soldiers can read them and think back. It is very necessary for people to write letters.
I think we have time for-
Tonight at 5 o'clock, a booth will open over by the statue where you can make a card to send to a current soldier.
We have time for one more question. One more.
What effect or what memories do you have from the rationing that went on during World War II? I know my mother has talked about it briefly, but she doesn't talk very much about those memories.
Well, as kids, we didn't notice it so much except for a shortage of bubble gum. The word would pass very quickly if some store got it. But because we did have a farm and access to other farms, we were able to get things that probably were limited to others. But such things as butter and meat and gasoline and other things were all rationed. In fact, I had with me some little coins that were used as a part of the rationing process to control how much you got. And you were also asked to turn in things like lard, because the glycerin in it was used in explosives. So it affected every aspect of life, and probably as noticeable as anything was the inability to travel. We're also accustomed to hopping in the car and driving to Wichita or Kansas City from here if we like. But with 5 gallons of gasoline a month, that just simply didn't happen.
We gave up putting sugar in our tea so that Mother could bake sweet things. So, you made adjustments and would rather eat it, I guess, than drink it.
Check our bootlegging too, by the way.
That's another panel.
Yes, when we were living at Midwest City across from Tinker Field, there was a commissary. So really, the military men, at least the Air Force, they were pretty well set, because I don't remember that we couldn't get probably some of the best food there. The only drawback I ran into was when I was pregnant with my daughter, and I craved cherries, just the cans of pie cherries of all the things. My sister back home, they ran a grocery store. She sent me a whole case of cherries.
I don't remember having any trouble getting gas. My dad had got me a little Ford Coupe, of course a used one, when I started working at Firestone. And all I can remember is I think we had a little booklet of green stamps. and I had to use the stamps to get, but I never had any trouble getting gas. And I certainly didn't have to pay almost $4 a gallon.
Well, that's about all of our time for our home front panel this afternoon. I want to thank Mark Olson, Doris Snyder, Bob, and Priscilla Reeves, and all of you for attending. We're going to take about a 15-minute break and be back with our panel on life on the battlefield. Thank you very much.